My name is Steve Keller. I am from Atlanta, Georgia. My brother and I bought about 30 acres of land about a year ago on Pressman's Home Road in Rogersville, Tennessee, very close to the intersection of Highway 66 and Highway 94. It is pretty mountain land, and we hope to build cabins and eventually retire there. The land is very wooded with just several old logging roads going through it. Last week, Dave and I spent 3 days clearing trees at the top of his property. We also set up a couple tents to camp there. The first night, there was nothing unusual. The second, about 10, we heard this very loud calling or howling not too far from our tents. It sounded like maybe a couple hundred yards away on the next parcel of land, which is very rugged. I started up and everything got silent, and a minute later we heard a similar sound coming from way off in the other direction. This went back and forth several times. Then it broke into an ongoing howling session for about 5 minutes. I have camped many times, and I have heard all kinds of howling, owls, coyotes, dogs, etc. But I've never heard anything like this in my life, nor had Dave. We were getting ready to pack up and get the heck out of there. But we were both exhausted from cutting trees all day, so we decided to stick it out. It really freaked me out though, knowing the only thing protecting us from whatever it was this nylon tent. I finally went back to sleep. The next morning, Dave told me he had slept out all night, and it started back again down at the bottom of our valley about 3 a.m. Apparently, it was very loud, and our neighbor's dogs went crazy barking at it. Don't know how I slept through it other than I was exhausted from the day before. The next day, we discussed it and how it had really freaked us out. We had the idea that we would try to record it the next night on our iPhones. The next night, we did not hear it. Just an owl. We left the next day. Okay, a couple of things that are unusual that add to the picture. 1. Since we bought this beautiful property, we have seen virtually no wildlife on it. No squirrels, no deer, no rabbits, no chipmunks, no nothing. The only animal that we have ever seen in over a year is one turkey and a couple of snakes. It is such a pretty place with so much vegetation that we were really starting to wonder what was wrong with it, that no animals would come there. Was it a toxic dumping ground? Something had to be wrong with it. So it was very unusual to hear any kind of animal howling on the property at night. Number 2. A couple from Florida owned both the 2 lots next to us. This sounded like it was where the howling was coming from that night. They, along with the father-in-law, were down this spring and trying to stake out their property lines up between the mountain. The father-in-law was further up the mountain when a rock about the size of a baseball came from out of nowhere, flew over his head, and was headed for Carl. He yelled for Carl to duck, and the rock just missed him by inches. Originally, we all thought it must have been a rock that came loose from the top of the mountain and they came rolling down. The likelihood of that is very unlikely because of all the trees. Since our experience the other night, I am really wondering if maybe it could be a Bigfoot living on Carl's land, which is very rough terrain. Could it be that a Bigfoot threw a rock at them that day? Could it also be that the reason there are no other animals anywhere on the property, that there is something living there that is scaring them off? I listened to some Bigfoot recordings on the internet when I got home, and several of them sounded very similar to what we heard that night. We are going back in a couple of weeks, but I doubt we will camp in the mountain again. It's just too freaky for me. I used to work with this guy who would always go walking with his dog in the woods of Windsor, Massachusetts, very late at night. He always used to say that the quiet of the late night is very relaxing. He'd always tell stories about weird things that he heard or animals he'd seen. But one morning he came into work and he was very shaken up, like something terrible had happened. We asked him what was wrong, and it took him a moment to answer. I was out with my dog last night in the woods. We were walking along the trail and there was a hill in front of us. I hear something coming down the hill, which startled me. So I looked up and saw what looked to be a man coming down the hill. That scared me at first, but as it got closer, I noticed it was covered in dark fur and was taller than an average man. It had a terrible musky odor to it that burned my nostrils. As it came down the hill, it noticed me and my dog. My dog's hair was standing up straight as an arrow, and I put my hand in a fist and brought it back to be ready to defend myself. Not 2 seconds later, it let out this very loud howl and ran away on its hind legs to the west faster than anything I had ever seen in my life. We all stood there, eyes wide and jaws dropped, waiting for him to say something else. He finished with, "I know one thing. That's the last time I ever go in those woods." And he went to his area and got to work. Let me know what you guys think. March 2nd, 2007. The witness had just gotten off work early and was traveling down 200 North. One of his coworkers was traveling in front of him, a good 300 feet or so, when he noticed that he had swerved rather fast. So the witness expected a deer to come running out, but that was not the case. What he saw was a black-furred animal on 2 legs walking all hunched over. He quickly tried avoiding it, but he believes he clipped it with his back end. He stopped, not sure what had just happened, and started looking for his driver's side mirror. He didn't see anything for a few seconds, but then something stood up right behind his Explorer. Terrified, the witness rolled down his window and could see the fear on his friend's eyes, who confirmed that he had seen the same creature. His friend started back to see it and heard it howling. The witness slipped through the windshield and saw the creature was trying to stand up on 2 legs again, but kept falling over. It eventually got on all fours and ran off into the woods. The 2 men then got out of their vehicles to look around but did not see anything. However, they did notice a large, fat moose, durable-looking rodent on the side of the road, which was not afraid of them at all. It picked it up and put it off into the grass. My Bigfoot sighting occurred on our dairy farm in Shenango County, south of Breckenridge, New York, in May 1961, when I was 14 years old. The sighting was around 1 p.m. in the afternoon in our family hillside woodlot, which was made up of primarily oak, maple, cherry, and peach trees. At the time, I was active in Boy Scouts, and having my own campsite was a priority. I located my campsite next to a small spring. Now, to a 14-year-old boy, this meant all the comforts of a home and a campsite. Plenty of wood for campfires, plenty of water, and plenty of protection against the elements in this section of woodland. I was going to the campsite when I heard a rustling noise at the spring. Thinking it might be a deer coming in for a drink, I moved as quietly as I could in the underbrush. Instead of a deer, about 50 to 100 feet from me, up rose this coal-black form, looking directly at me. At first, I couldn't figure out what was looking at me. My brain just couldn't sort it out. It wasn't a bear. In the shade of the trees, its eyes reflected a brilliant yellow, and its coat was shiny black. Very broad shoulders, no neck to speak of, and his head was rounded like a human's. What bothered me was I could not discern a face. It seemed covered in hair. The eyes seemed to be peeking out of hair that fell over its face. Its arms were at its side, and I could not see below its torso, as brush covered its lower half, so I could not see its hands or feet. It had a very broad trunk. It would estimate its height to be 6 feet. It just stood there swaying side to side looking at me, as if to say, "What am I looking at?" Just as I was. It never made any sound. Now I heard of Bigfoot. Old Dad had a subscription to a True magazine, and I had read Ivan Sanderson's stories, Jerry Crew, Ray Wallace, and John Green. But Bigfoot lived in the Pacific Northwest, not the East. When it dawned on me that I was looking at a Bigfoot, sheer panic and fear gripped me. I blasted out of there like a rifle shot. I ran down through the woods to a 4-strand barbed wire fence that separated the woodlot from a Christmas tree plantation and cleared it easily in one jump. At this point, I lost my sweater that I had tied around my waist. It had warmed up considerably that day. I continued to run through our Christmas tree plantation, cleared another fence, and when I reached an open pasture, I looked back, and nothing was following me. I made it back to our farm buildings in record time, about a half-mile from the sighting location, when I realized I had lost my sweater. If I recall correctly, my parents and younger brother were away at the time on a shopping trip in Binghamton, New York, and I was by myself. I decided to go back for my sweater, so I went back to our farm shop and got our trusty Stevens single-shot shotgun for courage. I knew it would not kill, let alone stop a squatch, and went back after my sweater. As I approached the fence where I lost it, I could hear something walking up the fence line. It must have known I had come back, because it sounded like it was stomping branches as if to say, "Don't come near me, stay away." I found my sweater, neatly draped over the strand of the fence, and tried to follow the Sasquatch up the fence line. There were several times I knew I was getting near him, but could not bring myself to get closer. Finally, I gave up my pursuit and went home. As I review this event, I would say I probably surprised a juvenile who was drinking at the spring. I would estimate it was a male, as I saw no breast or female features. Regarding the hair hanging down over his face, I know that Lauren Coleman has written about this feature of the Ohio woolly booger or other eastern sightings. It could be that he came up so fast from getting drink that he didn't have time to slick his hair back. I've told few people about that event, and later I told my family I had seen a bear. I note that many after a sighting are afraid to go back to the sighting location. I was never afraid to be alone in the woods. However, I noticed that in early February or March, I would feel at times as if I were being watched. However, it seemed that was the only time of the year that I felt uncomfortable. Since I moved to the Northwest in 1987, I have kept up my investigation. However, I have seen nothing like this since. Yeah, I had experienced a couple of incidents where I believe I heard howls or call. For most of my life, I lived in a small town in Fairfield County, Connecticut. I wasn't new to scary stories about ghost intruders and stalkers, but what I saw was far from that. It all started in January of 2011. I was waiting at the bus stop earlier than I usually would, so nobody was walking down the street. The morning felt off, but I shrugged it off as I thought it was the loneliness. But that quickly turned to fear as I heard a scream that sounded like a lowered pitch, stretched out yell of a coyote. It immediately sent shivers down my whole body. I wish the story would end there, but it didn't. After school, I would usually hang out with my friends. For anonymity, I will call them Liam and Charlotte. Liam, Charlotte, and I would proceed with our usual shenanigans down by the brook in the woods. There was a small bridge that would lead to a thicker woods that we'd go to build teepees and little forest and just hang out. As we were halfway through the bridge, I heard that same bone-chilling yell. "What the hell was that?" Coco asked, sounding concerned. We all looked at each other and decided to call it a day. As we quickly walked out into the light, we went up the snowy hill. That's when it caught our eye. A 8 to 9 foot tall creature that had brown hair and a Hulk-like build covered in hair. What was shocking is that it ran across the brook in 2 steps. The brook was about 32 feet across. We froze at what we saw and ran up the hill across the other side of the bank. Their footprints in the snow were bigger than any humans. I can't find any explanation of what it could have been. It couldn't be a bear or a human. Not even an escaped ape. This incident still freaks me out to this day, although I still go into the woods. I've never seen the creature or have heard any other accounts of this creature, so I'm hoping others can relate and give some closure and proof that I'm not insane. First, I'll tell you what happened to my friend. We'll call him John. Also, a little background. The three of us work together on a graveyard shift. What we do during downtime, of which there is a lot, we make different noises and calls and goof off. This will play an important part in the first two stories. John walked away from the vehicles of my other friend. We'll call him Pete. They walked out the dam next to the lake out there. It runs north-south along the east side of the man-made lake there. You can walk along the top and look down to the right or east, and that is a large ravine. There is a valve down there, in fact, to empty the lake into the Tuxchany River, in case the lake gets too full. It was here that John actually parted ways from Pete and moved down into the ravine. He found the valve, as he'd heard it was down there. Then he proceeded to move east further into the ravine, which was fairly wooded. As he walked, he began to whistle at Pete. He promptly was answered with 3 powerful wood knocks. When he described the story to me, he said it sounded as if a large branch was being beat against a tree. He kept whistling and received these knocks in return. He was under the assumption that they were coming from Pete. He said he believed they were coming from the south of the ravine up on an artificial ridge created by the overburden removed to create the lake. He assumed Pete had walked out onto the ridge and was playing around. He actually got irritated as he expected Pete to whistle back, and he didn't know what the heck he was doing with the wood knocks. He climbed back up the ravine and stood at the top of the dam to get a look at Pete to question him. It was at that time that John saw that Pete had actually gone back to the vehicles over 1,000 yards away, in southwest of Knot. Just his position, but where he had heard the knocking. Pete would later say upon discussion that he had never even went into the woods. He turned back when John went in because he didn't fancy getting ticks. Simultaneously during that event, while Pete had been at the vehicle, he had his own experience. He heard a hoot or a howl. Now one of the calls or noises we make at work, which is called the whale call. We try to mimic a humpback whale singing, including the stairwell we call the aquarium, for its fantastic acoustics. Pete assumes that this was John and returns the call. He's answered by the same call. This happens 3 more times before Pete doesn't get a response. The call came more east of Pete's position and just south of where John heard the knocks. Later, upon discussion, not only was John not there, he didn't do the whale call all that day. It was after all this that I arrived, and when we moved just northwest of the lake, about a mile or 2 to set up for shooting, we were just doing some target practice. While we were setting up, I hear a very low rumble come from the southeast. I stop dead what I'm doing, and I look up to see John looking me dead in the eye. A little confused, I say, "Is that thunder?" He responded with, "No. I checked before we left camp and there isn't a lightning strike within 200 miles. We didn't think too much of it. We did our first bit of shooting, which was immediately south of our position. When we stopped, we removed hearing protection. I again heard it, but it was moving west, towards our fjord of fire. It also sounded closer. This was the last I heard it. John said he heard it for the rest of the time we were there. When we packed up and left, he said it was really close and almost in our line of fire. Doesn't sound the way any animal should act. John also noted it was very bassy and he could hear. And he could feel it in his chest. He described them as short, powerful husks, almost. I don't know how to describe it really. He just made the sound. Later, me and John were talking about it and he told me what happened. I heard wood knots and immediately thought Sasquatch or skunk ape or whatever they are in these parts. He didn't really acknowledge what I said at that time. A couple hours later, though, I get a text saying, "This is what we heard." There was a link to the Gulf Coast Bigfoot Research Organization, the recordings page specifically. Supposedly the recordings were all from our general area. He said he spent the rest of the night not sleeping, with a 1,000-yard stare trying to keep a tear in. First-time poster, long-time lurker here. I came across this thread and thought I would share a story I've heard many times growing up in the Georgia deer woods. I'm actually quite surprised that there seems to be a lot of these stories that are coming from Hancock County. Not saying I believe one way or the other, but I just find these stories interesting. Especially the ones from Hancock, because that is where this story took place. Back in the early 70s, my dad and all of his half-brothers hunted something like a 3,000-acre tract behind the Devereaux store. The story goes that they were longbow hunting, or at least Archie White was. Possibly could have been beer drinking. And night road hunting to knowing my family. Anyway, has been said that Archie headed out for the evening with the longbow and quiver and a couple cans of beer. My dad has been adamant every time the story was told that while he was drinking, he was not drunk. Sitting on the ground, backed up to a tree, he dozed off when he awoke. There was this creature standing directly over him. Ugly, hairy, and mean-looking, and awful smelling. On the other end of this story, from the brothers' perspective, just at dark from their camp on a power line, they hear screams and see Archie running for them. No bow in hand, just holding what was left of the quiver and a couple of arrows. They say that to say he was shook up as an understatement, and more like he was freaked out to the point that he was, for the lack of a better word, crazy out of his mind. He was screaming about what had happened, all the while throwing his gear in the trunk of his car. They hunted out of cars back then. He told all of his brothers that he was leaving and they were crazy if they stayed, and that he would never hunt again. He never did. Uncle Archie passed away some years later on his deathbed. He told my dad to come to him so he could talk to him about the incident many years ago. He said he took a lot of kidding about that over the years, but he wanted to tell my dad that what he saw and what had happened was the truth. Just my story about the Hancock Deer Woods. In 1977, while fishing, my Uncle Bill, my Uncle Shep, and my Aunt Cora, now deceased, my mother Mary, were fishing the original Loop Road area of the Tamimi Trail. They were all fishing in this heavily wooded, swampy area, just talking and laughing as family members do when enjoying time together. It was a sunny day, but the overhanging tree line made it cool and filtered the sunlight. Loop Road has loads of wildlife and is in the Everglades National Preserve, home to the Misuki Indians. Loop Road is an excellent place to fish for bass and bream, or just take photos of nature and its keep. One Saturday at approximately 2 p.m., Uncle Bill says he ran out of night crawlers, so he decides to go back to the car, which was parked a few feet away from where everyone was fishing. He said he unlocked the trunk of the 1977 Pontiac Grand Prix and grabbed the small plastic container of night crawlers and began to close the trunk, when all of a sudden, he saw a figure some 40 feet away walk out of the tree line on the same side of the road everyone was fishing on. It stopped mid-stride and looked at him. As he peered along the trunk lid, it stood looking at my Uncle Bill for 3 seconds and quietly walked across the dirt road and into the tree line, swamp on the other side. Uncle Bill described it as being 5 feet tall and having long arms to the knees and was covered in a long, thin fur. He said you could see the light-colored skin through the fur. Bill said that the face was flat, with a flat nose, and that the hair was around the eyes and below them. And around the mouth, he says the eyes seemed like one dark color. In Uncle Bill's words, it scared the hell out of him. But he also said the most amazing thing was that this thing never made a sound. It didn't crack a branch as it walked out of and into the swamp. Uncle Bill said he made everyone quickly pack up their poles and hop into the car, and he quickly drove off. He has never been back to Loop Road before his passing. Myself and my brother always go out there today. We have never seen anything. Please know that Uncle Bill passed away 1997. This happened this past Thursday evening, right before Destination Truth comes on at 9 p.m. in my time zone. I am staying at my brother's place 2 doors down from where I live because I'm getting new floors put in my condo. For those that don't know, I live on a bluff that overlooks a river on the edge of a city in South Carolina. My brother was on the deck looking at Jupiter when I saw him through the window motion for me to come out. I went out and noticed a plane flying low overhead, but could still hear scuffling and pebbles hitting the tree line over this noise. My brother did a couple of owl calls. Then I tried my barred owl call. That is when the deer jumped over the edge of the bluff and cut across the yard, at an angle going towards the outdoor light. It was being followed by something that was below the edge of the bluff. It must have seen us and got royally pissed because it hissed. Now, the edge of the bluff is about 30 feet from the deck, and I would guess this creature was 10 feet below that gradually sloped edge. But you could hear it very plainly because the plane was gone by that time. A few seconds later, we got a whiff of a sewage-less sulfur smell, but it evaporated pretty quickly. Now, what do you think it was? Will a puma that isn't supposed to be in South Carolina hiss like that and put off a smell that tomcats will? Would they come that close to city limits looking for game if it's a puma? I never saw what it was. I just could tell what the direction that the hiss came in. The moon was not very high yet, and the outdoor light was a good 50 feet away. I looked this morning but couldn't find any prints or sign of struggle. It hasn't rained in weeks. I assume the pebbles could have rolled down the slope hitting trees and the boulders on the way down to the water's edge, and game trail if something was scrambling up the hill. The only thing that I can think of that can hiss like that is a big cat, but I didn't think they would wander that close in. Maybe it was following the river because of the drought and other prey that would be doing the same thing.